So let's go ahead and we're going to keep it moving. We're going to get into day 3, and we'll go ahead and go straight into closing arguments and see, again, what the prosecutor and what the defense are saying here. Did they get it right? Did the jury get it right in saying it was guilty? Let's find out and see what the summary is here. Yard work? That sounds like fun. Spring cleaning. Everybody's cleaning this weekend. I ain't mad at it.
Members of the jury, we end right where we began. It was an accidental discharge. I was trying to take the magazine out and it went off. They was both in bed. I was in their room. Those were the statements of the defendant, Jermaine Bass Jr.
Stuff.
Mere minutes after he murdered his daughter while she was laying in the top bunk of her bed. Those were his statements as he was holding his son, who was profusely bleeding from a gunshot wound to the side of his head that he caused. It was an accident. I was loading the magazine. I was in their room. Those statements you heard on the body-worn camera of Adam Lawman, HCSO deputy who first responded. I want to draw your attention on that same body-worn camera to the timestamp of 22:46:20, right after he made these statements. The defendant was asked, "What happened upstairs?" He looked straight at the deputies and he said, "Nothing happened upstairs." That man uttered those words, "Nothing happened upstairs," when he knew that his daughter was on that top bunk with a gunshot wound to the middle of her forehead, and she was bleeding out and she was about to die. He said, "Nothing happened upstairs." He didn't beg them to go save her. He didn't beg them to help her. He said, "Nothing happened upstairs." We end right where we began. Right where we began. Where defense counsel in their opening statement to you said, "My client did not shoot Jayla Bass or JJ."
Dang.
We know that's not true. We know he did it. We know the forensic evidence points to him. And I want you to recall when our blood spatter expert was on the stand. She said to you, "The scene will guide you to collect the evidence that is relevant so that you can piece together what happened." And members of the jury, that's exactly what happened throughout the duration of this trial. The testimony and evidence are pieces that, when laid together, form an arrow that point to the guilt of only one person in this case. The defendant murdered his 5-year-old daughter as she was sleeping, and he tried to murder his 8-year-old son, JJ. Remember this last Friday during jury selection, you were taught that the state has the burden to prove the elements of the crimes charged beyond a reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the thing.
And in fact, she just read it in a study. It helps to know what the elements are, what we're focusing on as we go through discussing how and why we know the defendant is guilty of each element of each crime charged in this case. We'll go one by one. First degree premeditated murder. To prove the crime of first degree premeditated murder, the state must prove the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Jayla Bass is dead. Number 2, the death was caused by the criminal act of Jermaine LaVonda Bass. And number 3, there was a premeditated killing of Jayla Bass. He's also guilty counts of aggravated child abuse. There we talk about number one, Jermaine LaVonda Bass committed aggravated battery upon Jayla Bass or Jermaine Bass. That's counts 2 and 3. Jayla Bass or Jermaine Bass were under the age of 18. We know that. Jermaine LaVonda Bass actually and intentionally caused bodily harm to Jayla Bass or Jermaine Bass, counts 2 and 3. In doing so, Jermaine LaVonda Bass intentionally or knowingly caused great bodily harm. You know that as well. You saw the gunshot wounds. The last count he's charged with is count 4, premeditated murder. Jermaine LaVonda Bass intended to commit the crime of first-degree premeditated murder. Number 2, Jermaine LaVonda Bass committed an overt act toward the commission of first-degree premeditated murder that went beyond mere preparation.
Premeditated murder is a tough one for me.
LaVonda Bass failed to complete the first-degree premeditated murder.
How do y'all feel about that? Premeditated murder. Are you buying it? Was this premeditated? I don't know, man. I'm not seeing premeditated murder in this instance.
Let's talk about how and why we know the defendant is the one who pulled the trigger. And let's talk about how and why we know that he did it intentionally. We know that the defendant started out his night.
Premeditated murder seems a little...
by leaving his 5-year-old and his 7-year-old home alone in their beds. We know that's true. 5 and 7, home alone at nighttime. We know that he followed his wife Shirley to her family dinner in the West Shore area at Ruth's Chris restaurant. How do we know that? States Exhibit 21. We can track his cell phone records. He leaves the children home alone by at least 7:15 p.m. We know that's true because of the video surveillance shows him leaving before that time. We know that Shirley got to dinner and that the defendant arrived in the West Shore area where Ruth's Chris is located. And around 10 o'clock, we know that he's calling Shirley and he's leaving by 10:01. We heard testimony from Shirley's niece, who's kind of more like a cousin, they're similar in age, China Gadsden. She explained to you what she saw that night. She saw the defendant in his Nissan truck pull in front of Shirley's car that she was driving. Stop, get out, walk up to the vehicle, and confront Shirley for going to a family dinner. You know, he immediately got back in his car and went to his house. That's what States 21 shows, through his phone records. We know that's true. Just like Anna Cox said, the evidence will reveal to you what happened. Other evidence that reveals this, in fact, is true, that the defendant followed Shirley to her dinner and confronted her, is the eye on crime camera video footage that we see of the defendant's car. We can read between the lines of the evidence we have as to the way the defendant was feeling at the time he arrived back home and went inside where 5-year-old Jayla Bass was sleeping in the top bunk. And 8-year-old Jermaine Bass, JJ, was laying right next to her. Now again, the scene will reveal itself. You only have to follow it. We know that the children were in the bed together. Laying side by side in the bed. I'm putting up States 24A because the forensic evidence tells us so. We know that Jayla Bass was laying closest to the wall.
Jeez.
Her head,
That's
where
this is wild.
blood is seen, and that JJ's head was right next to her, either touching the mattress or slightly above. At the point in time that the firearm was pointed at their heads and the trigger was pulled. Remember last Friday when we discussed premeditation, Mr. Terry was talking to you about there's no specific time frame when you're trying to decide whether or not an act was premeditated. It can happen in an instant. Recall that today, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office firearm expert Jennifer Michaelon took the stand and explained to you what would have to take place in order for that Glock 42 to fire. She explained you first have to take the magazine. You have to load it with bullets. You have to put that filled magazine inside the bottom well of the firearm.
Not necessarily.
You then have to slide the top of the firearm back in order for it to fire. Then, like she explained, when she's firing these firearms regularly during the course of her investigations as a firearm expert, she uses two guns to be able to safely and precisely point and aim within a 6-inch area. Loading the magazine with bullets, putting the magazine inside of the firearm, sliding the top back to make it ready.
There's no
And she
evidence of
further
that.
explained, not only do you have to point it and aim it, each time you pull the trigger, you have to pull it hard enough to first compress the trigger pull, safety, and then the trigger itself. And she explained to you that because it is not an automatic firearm, that each time you pull the trigger, you have to pull it and let it go, and 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 pull it and let it go. And members of the jury, that evidence is the scene itself, the evidence revealing to you what premeditation is. All of those steps is the scene revealing to you through evidence what premeditation is. Look at the bullet holes. On these precious children's face. Look at that.
Objection, Your Honor, improper
Sustained.
argument. I
Look.
ask the jury be disregarded.
Right. The jury's to disregard the last statement by the prosecutor. Speak facts. Let's talk about the facts.
Look where the bullet holes are located.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Danny in real life says, I believe the jury has doubts just like us, but looking at those photos, sir had to go. Somebody had to go. All of them need to go. I'm with you on that. You see gross negligence by both parents in this instance, leaving the kids at home, not being concerned about the kids, having loaded weapons, not in the safe, multiple rounds of ammo. It's already, and then your daughter ends up dead, son ends up shot, and his life's changed forever. Yeah, it's sad.
On Jayla Bass's head. Those are aimed, precise, deliberate bullet holes. That is not an accident. That is not loading the firearm and it going off. Those are aimed, precise, deliberate shots. Shots that require some sort of control over the firearm. Shot through her cheek, her temple, and her forehead.
Jeez.
Jennifer Michaelon says that shots that are within 6 inches of one another require her to use 2 hands to shoot. This is the shot
No, there were multiple
on the
bullet
son,
shots.
JJ's head. Now, recall he's laying right next to his sister in the bed, the top bunk. We don't know what order they were shot, but consider the proximity when deciding how deliberate these shots are. Consider the proximity when deciding how precise they are. That is the evidence revealing to you premeditation, intent, and deliberate shots. Shots that are aimed at the most crucial part of a human being's body. Recall, the scene will reveal to you the evidence necessary for you to come to a conclusion as to what happened. We know from the defendant's wallet that was seized, states 15.
Great question. Why did he have a weapon in the kids' room? That's
Recall
insane.
that this wallet was taken directly found in a closed drawer within a wallet that was right next to the firearm used to murder Jayla and Jay, an attempt to murder JJ, and right next to ammunition found. Note on this, height, Jermaine Lavonda Bass Jr. 5'7". Why is that important? Let's consider the trajectory of the fires shot that killed Jayla Bass and almost killed JJ.
Yeah. I wonder why he kept JJ alive.
We know that the children were laying next to each other. We know that the blood shown in the pulling of this photo of the top mattress belongs to Jayla Bass because of her head. Consider the trajectory of the bullets you see. Knowing the bunk bed is, topmost portion of the bunk bed is 5 feet 5 inches tall. The defendant is taller than that. We know that
Yeah.
damage A is at a downward trajectory, meaning that when the gun was fired, it has to be angled upward, downward to cause that downward trajectory. We know that this shot goes all the way through to the bathroom in a downward trajectory because we saw evidence of that. The scene will reveal the evidence necessary for you to decipher what happened. Whoever was holding the firearm had to have been taller than 5 feet 5 inches tall.
Well, not
We know
necessarily.
that
It was a bunk bed.
there was no stippling found on the wounds of Jayla Bass, meaning that whoever fired the weapon pointing right at her had to be at least, from the testimony, at least 2 to 3 feet away from her. If you follow the trajectory of the bullet holes that you see here, take them out 2 to 3 feet. That takes you off the bed. At a height consistent with the defendant holding his hand above the rail and pointing it downward. We know also that the person standing on the outside of this bunk bed, at least 2 to 3 feet away from where the children were laying. We know the trajectory as well because of the impact blood stain pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Anna Cox, when she testified, was very educational when she was describing to you what blood stain pattern analysis is. She explained that it's a discipline of forensic science focusing on identifying, documenting, and analyzing bloodstains in order to interpret what caused the distribution. Basically, in layman's terms, she says she looks
It's a
at
good,
the
fair
bloodstain
question.
and tries to decide how it got there. She went on to explain to us different kinds of bloodstains and what they mean and how she interprets them. One of them was an impact bloodstain, or an impact spatter pattern, which she said a natural object striking the liquid blood. She said she considered things such as physics, the natural laws of gravity, and introduction of a mechanism such as force. So if something were to hit an object of bleeding, it would cause a certain pattern, a blood pattern stain. Directionality, flow pattern. She said in her expert opinion, based on the DNA evidence that was swabbed from this area, it showed that both JJ and Jayla's heads were in this corner of the bed at the time in which they were shot. That's an important piece of evidence because, remember, we end where it began. When defense mentioned in their opening statement to you that their client didn't pull the trigger. Well, members of the jury, it's one thing to make a statement like that and then move on. But it requires you to pull the thread, to follow the analysis, to let the scene reveal to you what happened. And you have to follow it until the end.
Now, if y'all haven't watched Suits, this is Katrina Bennett for real.
The DNA.
The mannerisms and everything.
Now, recall this series of events. The children.
This is crazy. They're like twins.
They're on the top bunk. When law enforcement arrives, the defendant is holding his son, who's profusely bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head. When he's asked, "Where's the firearm?" he explains to the deputies that it's on top of a dresser, and later explains that it's in the drawer. In the
Mistake
master
number
bedroom
one, talking to the police.
of the dresser. So let's keep pulling the thread, because what does that mean? It means that after he murdered his daughter Jayla, and after he shot his son in the temple, that he left them there, walked all the way past 2 bathrooms into the master bedroom, and he opened up that silver drawer. He put the gun and the magazine inside, and he closed that dresser drawer before doing anything else.
But why? As Ducky Dexter said,
It's
why?
significant. The gun was in a closed dresser drawer. If an accident happened in the room with his children, would not a reasonable parent render aid immediately?
Objection, Your Honor, improper argument.
Overruled.
It's not reasonable to believe that it was an accident. It's not reasonable to believe that after this firearm accidentally discharged 5 times, that someone would then walk past 2 bedrooms into a different room, open a drawer, place the firearm inside of that drawer, and close it before doing anything else. It is not reasonable to believe. We also know the defendant didn't call 911.
Objection, improper argument, Your Honor.
Sustained.
The phone records show that at 10:34, the defendant dialed out to a number belonging to his mother. Anna Cox was right. The scene reveals the evidence necessary for you to come to a conclusion as to what happened. The defendant loaded his firearm with a magazine. He slid it back to load it. He then stood on the outside of that gray bunk bed, put his arm up and over the railing, and fired at his children as they lay sleeping in the top bunk of the bed.
Dang.
The evidence reveals that he shot his daughter Jayla 3 times and she died. The evidence reveals that he shot his son JJ in the temple, causing severe injuries that he still suffers from. The DNA puts the firearm in his hands. The trajectory puts the firearm in his hands. And members of the jury, the evidence, when put together, forms an arrow pointing at the guilt of only one person in this case. The defendant, Jermaine Bass, murdered his daughter, Jayla Bass, who was 5 years old. And he did it with intention, he did it with precision, and he did it with premeditation.
I don't know.
The defendant tried to kill his son, JJ. And he did it with intention, he did it with precision, and he did it with premeditation. And the law and the evidence demand that you find him guilty.
There's no record.
Yep. Take down the exhibit.
All right. So what do y'all think so far? I mean, we got to give the prosecutor a round of applause. So far, a lot of it's making sense. When it comes to reasonable doubt on certain things, the premeditation, I don't know. But if you look at the definition of premeditation, there's a few key factors. I'm going to read those to y'all. So intent to kill, the person must have had the conscious intention to take another's life. Planning or forethought, the act must be considered and prepared for in some way before it happens. This doesn't mean months of planning. It can be minutes or hours of reflection before committing the act. Deliberation, the person must have had time to think about their actions, even briefly, and still decided to go through with it. So with that being said, let me know what y'all think.